A former prosecutor at the Nuremberg war crimes trial condemned NATO's bombing campaign in Kosovo as the most brazen international aggression since the Nazis invaded Poland. Walter J. Rockler, co-author of the Nuremberg Principles, said it violated and shredded the basic provisions of the UN Charter and other conventions and treaties. UN Resolution 2131, paragraph 1 declares, "No state has the right to intervene directly or indirectly for any reason in the internal or external affairs of any state. A forceful military intervention in any country it terms an aggression and a crime without justification." Kosovo was an autonomous province of Yugoslavia from 1974 until 1989. Belgrade revoked autonomy following the harsh persecution and expulsion of the Serb minority population by the Kosovars, the Albanian majority. For Serbs to be forced from their ancestral homeland was intolerable. Historically and culturally, Kosovo is the heart of Serbian identity. It's the seat of the Orthodox Church and the site of a famous defeat by the Turks in 1389, a battle that changed the course of Serbian history for centuries. When in the early 1990s the Albanian Kosovars started their guerrilla war to gain independence, the Serbs fought back to restore order and retain their historic homeland. Using a familiar guerrilla tactic, units of the Kosovo Liberation Army would deliberately site their strongholds in civilian communities. This meant that any Serb offensive could be readily presented as brutal and indiscriminate aggression. But driving out guerrilla fighters and expelling civilians was the only way the Serbs could ensure these villages did not provide future bases for resistance. NATO had no rights of any kind to entitle it to interfere in the affairs of the sovereign state of Yugoslavia. Its own charter defined NATO as a defensive alliance, with no power to initiate hostilities. That only changed when the alliance modified its charter some 2 months after bombing began, a clear recognition of the fact it had acted illegally.
This weekend, NATO underwent something of a quiet revolution. NATO was founded as a purely defensive alliance, promising never to attack unless threatened. But now it has given itself the right to intervene in international crises. Whether this new doctrine survives will depend entirely on what happens in Kosovo.
The enormity of the air assault wasn't confined to it being immoral, illegal, and unethical. At 15,000 feet, it was the height of hypocrisy, masquerading as enlightened humanitarianism.
This is a campaign, it's an activity which is a moral campaign, a moral war, in order to defend principles. We cannot allow ethnic cleansing to continue in Europe as we approach the 21st century.
With crusading zeal, political leaders fired up the rhetoric of the righteous cause.
This is not a battle for territory. This is a battle for humanity. It is a just cause. It is a rightful cause.
If we want Europe to be undivided and democratic and at peace for the first time in history, and if we don't want your successors to have to come to this continent and fight another bitter war, then we must stand in Kosovo for the elemental principle of the common humanity of every breathing, living person in this continent.
The US and Western powers claimed that intervention was a major step forward in protecting human rights, promoting peace, democracy, prosperity, and stability. NATO claimed it was to prevent an ongoing humanitarian catastrophe. There was no evidence for this when bombing began, and it was later accepted that the main exodus of Kosovo Albanians was a consequence of bombing and not the cause. In reality, it was a war willed by the West for its own selfish political ends. At every step, Allied actions conspired to bring it about. Why? Because after the Cold War, it would provide a new purpose and a long-term presence for NATO in this strategic location in the heart of Europe. It would also give Western powers scope for huge political influence and economic opportunity. And so, every aspect of the NATO involvement was engineered to that end, from the manipulation and bypassing of the United Nations to the cynical and dishonest peace diplomacy at Rambouillet. from the grossly distorted propaganda demonizing the Serbs through to the creation of the ICTY, a rogue international court with rigged rules to convict and condemn them in perpetuity. The whole scheme was orchestrated by US Secretary of State Madeleine Albright from Washington, where the Kosovo conflict was widely referred to as Madeleine's War. Her core aim was always regime change. As she wrote, the problems of Kosovo and the region would not be solved until Milosevic was removed from power. Milosevic was the last powerful obstacle to the integration of the Balkans into a democratic Europe. Milosevic was, in fact, freely elected president in 1990 and then re-elected, albeit more controversially, in 1992. The catalyst for NATO intervention was the alleged massacre of 45 Albanian civilians by Serb military police at Račak in Kosovo on the 15th of January 1999. Since the Serbs had invited a television crew to film their action against the KLA military stronghold, such an atrocity seemed on the face of it highly unlikely. But the American head of the OSCE verification team, William Walker, rushed to the scene the following day with a press pack in tow and instantly declared it to be an unspeakable massacre. Račak has since been dismissed as a crude KLA hoax, where they dressed their combat dead in civilian clothing. A Finnish forensic team later categorically stated there was no evidence of a massacre. But Walker's on-the-spot claim was the galvanizing event used to outrage world opinion and justify NATO bombing.
Did he seek direct instruction now from the Americans?
Without calling on any of my capitals, I told what I thought I had seen, which was the end result of a massacre.
William Walker, the head of the Kosovo verification mission, called me on a cell phone from Račak.
But you don't remember calling Washington at all?
I got a call from Bill Walker. He said, "There's a massacre. I'm standing here. I can see the bodies."
And you didn't speak to General Clark or anybody like that?
Peace talks were quickly arranged at Rambouillet, where the American negotiators were clearly less than honest brokers. Most Western leaders were seeking a settlement both sides could accept, but the Americans had another outcome in mind.
The second and acceptable outcome was to create clarity where previously there had been ambiguity, and clarity as to which side was the cause of the problem, clarity as to which side NATO should defend and which side NATO should oppose. And that meant the Kosovo Albanians agreeing to the package and the Serbs not agreeing to the package.
If the Serbs would not agree and the Albanians would agree, then there was a very clear cause for using force.
From its inception in the early 1990s, the KLA had been trained, equipped and funded by German intelligence and the CIA. Its leader, Hashim Thaçi, known to his own people as the Snake, had a long and shocking track record of criminal activities, including drug smuggling, prostitution, and trafficking in human organs. Yet Thaçi, who is now awaiting trial in The Hague for war crimes, was the man courted by the Americans at the Rambouillet peace talks. They knew his mere presence would deeply offend the Serbs and render them even less likely to sign any agreement. The start of NATO's bombing campaign was accompanied by a major propaganda offensive.
This place, Kosovo, is right on the doorstep of Europe. It's right next door to Greece, to Italy, to places people are very, very familiar with in Britain. This is why we have to act. It's not that we enjoy the spectacle of using military force. We don't. We shrink from it. We've tried for months to avoid it. But we're doing it because we genuinely believe in the name of humanity and in the name of peace in this region. We have no alternative.
Serbian forces were accused of massive ethnic cleansing, a brutal policy of wholesale genocide against Kosovo Albanians, and the use of mass rape as an instrument of war.
The Albanians of Kosovo, it seems, are paying the price for NATO's airstrikes. According to these refugees who had just crossed the border into Albania itself, 20 men from their villages were executed. The victims, they say, included a headmaster and several teachers who were first separated from their wives and children and then shot.
These are our fellow human beings, Husbands taken from wives, fathers taken from children, never to see them again, never knowing if they're dead or alive, as they walk mile upon mile to a safety they may never find. Old women humiliated, young men massacred, just for being Albanian, just for being there when the Serb killing machine arrived.
7 towns on the Albanian border are reported to be burning, and on the Macedonian border, as we've all seen on television, Jakovica is in flames. Thousands of refugees are streaming across the border from Kosovo into Albania, and there are also reports that civilians may be used as human shields to protect Milosevic's military machine. If that is true, this would of course be a war crime in its own right.
Yugoslav President Slobodan Milosevic was constantly defamed as a dictator and war criminal on a par with Hitler. All these allegations were later shown to be gross distortions of the truth. For members of the International Press Corps, the Balkans conflicts presented a major challenge. Most reporters were largely ignorant of the complex Byzantine history and politics of the region, and crucially, hardly any spoke the language. They relied heavily on local interpreters and officials who'd been primed with prepared stories and propaganda. In the First Balkan War, the Bosnian Muslims of Sarajevo set up a sophisticated press centre to guide coverage. It was the source of more than 90% of the stories in the Western media. Few journalists made it as far as Belgrade to hear the Serbian side. Journalists who were bold enough to challenge the official line risked being found shot dead in a ditch.
We have nothing against the media, but RTS is not media. It's full of government employees who are paid to produce propaganda and lies. To call it media is totally misleading.
In Kosovo, the one-stop news source was NATO's daily press briefings. The prestige and authority of the alliance press machine only lent credence to unsubstantiated reports of Serb atrocities, massacres and rapes. These were endlessly repeated on the newly created 24-hour rolling news channels. Nothing is more effective than relentless repetition to imprint propaganda and reinforce prejudice. As with every war, truth was the first casualty, and the body count grew exponentially. Detailed reports of barbaric savagery, even when coupled with disclaimers about the untested veracity of the subject matter, can't and don't erase the initial impact and apparent authority of what goes out on television or appears in print. This is the BBC's Jeremy Bowen reporting from the Kosovo border on what he termed Serbia's programme of forced deportations of Albanian refugees.
I've been here about 4 or 5 hours now, and the people have just kept on coming. I'm running out of words to describe how these people have suffered, except to say that it's cruel, brutal, inhumane, and criminal. We've seen it far too many times since the Yugoslav wars started in 1991.
As they moved off, one refugee said, "Even God has abandoned us."
The Serbs had been officially declared the bad guys, and it was open season on them. The exploitation of the Western news appetite for shock horror journalism was a business model that created a real tension between the actual facts and the story told. Journalists and editors who valued their careers felt like politicians that, without a firm, consistent line on an issue, they risked looking weak or incompetent. Letting new facts alter the narrative to put the story right was only seen as an admission that you'd got it wrong in the first place. So, in the old newsroom cliché, there was huge pressure not to let the facts get in the way of a good story. The ethical failure of the press corps was matched by the conduct of the military. The course of the bombing campaign was dictated by the need to preserve lives, the lives of NATO airmen. As military analyst Paul Robinson put it, the alliance was prepared to kill, but not to die. In the entire 78-day campaign, not a single NATO life was lost. The death toll of around 2,000 was exclusively on the ground. NATO's risk aversion was such that it seriously constrained their effectiveness and so prolonged the bombardment. Because Serb anti-aircraft artillery was hidden and highly mobile, it was very hard to detect. NATO, to stay safe, rained down bombs from high altitude. Inevitably, this made targeting difficult, impaired accuracy, and meant that military targets were missed. Civilians found themselves in the front line. Collateral damage to schools, homes, hospitals, factories, bridges, television stations, and notoriously the Chinese embassy was widespread. The core features of a just war, discrimination and proportionality, were noticeably absent. More than 50% of Serbian industry and infrastructure was wiped out. The use of uranium-depleted shells contaminated the countryside with radiation. Even the American-funded Human Rights Watch condemned the deliberate bombing of civilian infrastructure and strongly criticized the use of cluster bombs, which it alleged killed significantly more civilians than the number claimed by the alliance. Targets chosen by NATO, it said, were disproportionate and should be found violations of international humanitarian law. NATO's daily briefings naturally painted a picture of wave after wave of surgical strikes carried out with clinical efficiency by 1,000 planes. The enemy war machine, we were told, was being seriously and successfully degraded. In May, however, a Newsweek exclusive claimed that 3,000 Allied sorties had resulted in the disabling of just 3 Yugoslav tanks. But NATO spokesman Jamie Shea remained relentlessly upbeat even when farcically self-contradictory. On May the 16th, he reported significant success, in the next breath stating that Serb forces had expanded their operations on the ground. Collateral damage soon became the major issue. Passenger trains, road convoys of farmers in tractors, and the Chinese embassy were all bombed in error, according to NATO. But as the campaign intensified, so the list of targets grew ever wider. Factories, power and water plants, and oil refineries were all bombed on the ground that they were contributing to or supportive of the Yugoslav military. By that criterion, of course, practically everything was fair game. The campaign may have worked finally, but it wasn't a clean and a clear win, and it left one big question hanging in the air.
We're now in a new world era where national sovereignty can be overridden in the interests of human rights.
In theory, yes, because that's exactly what they've done. They've interfered in the sovereign country and done what they think ought to be done. Now, traditionally, boundaries are sacrosanct. They no longer are. But in practice, the agony, the discussions, the disagreements within NATO made it a very difficult operation for them to carry out. So in theory, yes. In practice, much harder to do again.
On its first day, the Kosovo bombing campaign was widely condemned at a special meeting of the UN Security Council. Its president, Chin Hu-sin of China, called it a blatant violation of the UN Charter and the accepted norms of international law. The Kosovo issue, he said, was an internal affair of the Federal Republic of Yugoslavia and should be solved by the parties concerned in that country among themselves. Speaking on behalf of his country, he said China opposed the use or threatened use of force in international affairs and the power politics of the strong bullying the weak. It opposed interference in the internal affairs of other states under whatever pretext, in whatever form.
We certainly do not wish to defend violations of international humanitarian law, whoever does this. But to combat violations of the law, that is only possible using clean hands, only on the solid basis of the law. Otherwise, lawlessness would generate lawlessness. It is unthinkable that a national court in a civilized democratic country would justify illegal methods for combating crimes.
The Kosovo campaign was an unprecedented violation of sovereign rights, and it set a dangerous precedent for future international relations. It brutally exposed the impotence of the United Nations to constrain a superpower.
The United Nations Secretary-General Kofi Annan made it pretty clear last night that he was upset that the UN hadn't been involved in the decision over airstrikes, and that the Security Council should have been consulted if NATO had played it by the book of international law. Dennis Healey was a long-serving Labour Defence Secretary, and Lord Healey, I suppose, one of the few senior politicians around with first-hand memory of the last time there was a war in Europe.
Indeed.
What are your reservations about the NATO action?
I think it was a terrible mistake to attack a sovereign state without even consulting the United Nations. I think it will have, indeed has already had, a catastrophic effect on Western relations with Russia and China. For Yeltsin, it is a catastrophe because it strengthens his communist and nationalist opponents, and already describing it as a second Vietnam.
The UN, the nearest thing we have to a world government, had neither authorized war in Kosovo nor prevented it. When it was all over, it simply stood back and washed its hands of responsibility.
I suppose the UN could be criticized for having taken a bit of a back seat so far. Do you think the UN has been slow in trying to solve this problem?
Good grief, no. I mean, we obviously had to take a back seat or a side seat as far as the war was concerned because it wasn't a UN war, it was a NATO air war. But as far as the UN's legitimate field of action is concerned, we've been very much in the forefront leading the response to the humanitarian tragedy that engulfed the region.
The illegal pounding of a sovereign state into submission by bombing its civilians and utterly devastating an entire economy cannot qualify as humanitarian action by any stretch of the imagination. It was, in truth, the ultimate crime against humanity, a war of aggression.
Today, I cannot be persuaded that random destruction and killing in Yugoslavia by strong powers against the weak was anything less than killing in the service of arrogance, and I repudiate the shabby pretexts for this criminal conduct.
It was NATO behaving like the Nazis.